I'm going to show you why you should be worried about digital ID, and I'm going to do it in a couple of ways. Firstly, I'm going to show you what they really want to use it for, because they are more than hinting, they are near enough telling you exactly what they want to use it for. Secondly, with an email from one of my viewers who was almost tricked into signing up for a digital ID that she didn't want. She thought it was mandatory, but it wasn't, and she spotted it before doing so. And finally, a series of major cock-ups by various organizations with data breaches, leaks, and why your data is just simply not safe. And yes, I think that is a technical term because the word cock-up, one theory is that it came from archery, where the cock of an arrow was the bit at the back with the fletching, and to have it cocked up was to go wrong. So that's one theory, but there are a number of others. So firstly, let's go to what they really want it for, because here is where they are comparing it with other jurisdictions, what they've used it for, and kill surprise if that's what they want to do here. Listen to this.
We will learn from the experiences of other countries, some of whom have had digital ID for over 20 years. Many show us just how transformative this can be. In Denmark, a graduate applying for jobs only has to log into a portal once.
Therefore, if they log into a portal once that has their entire student history, it will obviously have everything about them, their study history, where they studied, and everything else. Many of which might be a data breach in some people's eyes, but let's listen on.
And their ID automatically links to their school records, saving them retyping their qualifications each time. In Finland, a parent can go online to register their children for daycare without uploading a payslip or putting in their salary, and the site automatically calculates the right fee.
Meaning it will have not only the parents' details and their salary and their earnings, but also the details of their child, the age of their child, where they live, where they'll be going to daycare. So if anybody nefarious wanted to know where their children went to daycare and they did hack that system, they will have access to everything about those parents, those children, where they are, how old they are, the names of the children, and everything of that sort.
And in Estonia, a digital ID means that when you have a baby, you don't have to go to a local office to register the birth or sign up for childcare benefits or apply for nursery places. It happens automatically from day one in the hospital.
And whilst that might sound awfully convenient, what it means is every baby born is immediately on a database, tracked from birth, and that obviously links to you, links to the home address, links to where they go to school, and absolutely everything. A complete haven for a nefarious hacker who wants to get hold of a blueprint of somebody's data, right literally from birth. So as convenient as all that sounds, you'll probably agree that the more data they hold on you, the higher the risk if it gets breached. Now, I hope most of you will agree that I try to give you both sides of any given story. There's always more than one way to look at a story, and I try to give you at least two different ways of looking at it. That can be very different, however, when you're reading news articles and you get different headlines, depending on the political bias of the news outlet. And that is why I use a service called Ground News, who sponsors my channel here. So I'd like to give you an example of just how that might work in practice. Take this article, for example, about the release of hostages by Hamas following Trump's intervention to encourage peace. The headline broadly as follows: Hamas frees Israeli hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners under Trump's Gaza ceasefire deal. Now, as mentioned, there are multiple news outlets, some lean left and some lean right, and even with something as historic as this, there are subtle different takes within the headlines themselves. Now, you can see that there's a biased distribution on the right-hand side here. The vast majority are central when reporting on this story, but some of them lean left and some of them lean right. Now, we can see a biased comparison by Ground News AI in the middle here, and it says that the left emphasizes humanitarian cost and diplomacy, using terms like surviving, living, prisoners, man-made famine, and genocide, portraying the release through human rights and post-war governance lenses. The right-leaning outlets, however, emphasize Israeli victimhood, triumphalism, and security, using freed and hostages, a historic day, terror group, unspeakable atrocities, framing the swap as costly but necessary victory in stressing leadership credit. Looking at what Ground News categorizes as a left-leaning outlet, Crikey says Israeli and Hamas exchange captives as Trump hogs the limelight. Another that Ground News considers far left, Israel frees 96 Palestinians remaining abducted under life sentence. Comparing that with some right-leaning headlines, or far-right, from the Gateway pundit, breaking: Hamas terrorists finally begin releasing innocent Israeli hostages. So you can see a very different take on exactly the same story. And one more for illustration from OAN: first 7 freed hostages cross into Israel after 738 days. And of course, as they're a partner to my channel here, you get a great discount, which is 40% off, 40% off, using the link ground.news/BBB, and that will give you unlimited access to the world's news, and it will let you know if any of the stories have been biased in any way, and even who owns those news outlets if that's of interest to you. So head over to ground.news/BBB for your 40% discount so that you can get both sides of any story. Now, let me move to an email that I received from one of my viewers, because this is quite telling. I'm going to read it out, and I will try to put the text on screen with some wizardry, but without disclosing the company or, of course, my viewer's name and so on. So my viewer writes: something disturbing happened to me yesterday relating to digital ID, and I wanted to reach out to you with this information because I don't have a platform to raise the alarm. I think you might find it of interest, and I do. I've recently accepted a new job offer with a large company and was sent a link to fill in some new starter information online, or so I thought. The website directed me to install an app, which I won't name, but it is a digital ID sort of app, supposedly to provide some more information and documents to my employer. I downloaded the app and it started asking me questions, beginning with the usual name, date of birth, and then it asked me how old I was, and the options were 13 and above or 12 and under. I thought that was odd, but I kept going, my viewer writes. Next, it needed to collect biometric data to continue, and that I needed to provide consent. Alarm bells went off in my head and I closed the app. I emailed HR to tell them that I did not consent to providing my biometric data, and that they would need to tell me how to proceed without doing so. Now, one thing I can commend here is that the alarm bells went off and that my viewer stopped in tracks to question something. Always be open to question something, please. If you receive a message, if you receive an email, receive a phone call, or you're asked to do something, even if it's by a prospective or new employer, please question what you're being asked to do, as my viewer did here. My viewer goes on. HR responded and said that I could just bring in documents in the usual way on my first day and provide them with my line manager. There was no pushback at all. I found it odd that they would be paying money for an app when I could just bring in my documents to work on my first day like I've always done in the past. Passport, driving license, etc. I was watching your video, Devastation You Can't Imagine, this afternoon, and you mentioned that the government wants to roll out digital ID to everybody aged 13 and over, which is something that I read literally a couple of days ago. This reminded me of the bizarre age question I encountered on the app. So I immediately Googled the app to find out more. Apparently, it's a voluntary digital ID that can be used to verify your information for work, among other things. According to the app's website, they're already working with the Home Office. Quelle surprise. The link to the website is as follows, which I'm not going to give you for many reasons. I was horrified, my viewer writes. I was almost tricked into setting up digital ID without my knowledge or consent. I'd assumed it was just part of the onboarding process with a new company. Had no information was given to me to tell me what it actually was. At no point did my prospective employer advise that I'll be asked to set up a voluntary digital ID, which in my opinion, my viewer's opinion, was clearly intended as a precursor to mandatory government ones. Luckily, my instinct was to refuse to provide consent as soon as my biometric data was requested, but this makes me wonder how many other people have already been pressured or hoodwinked into unknowingly setting up a voluntary digital ID in this way. I'm sure it wouldn't be difficult for the government to obtain this information from the app if they wanted to in the future, and I suggest they probably would. They've probably got a direct link in already. Probably, I don't know. And automatically turn these voluntary IDs into government ones. That's the concern that I've got here, because my viewer's concern, which I share, is that if you set up a voluntary digital ID with one of these apps who purport to work with the Home Office, and then they say, right, we are rolling it out, and because you've signed some terms and conditions, and buried in the terms and conditions somewhere, it's literally my job to read terms and conditions sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not so fun, but usually, and I bet buried in the bottom of the terms and conditions somewhere, it will be, we will share your information with said third parties, and I'm going to read it and edit this video if I find something to that effect. My viewer concludes, I am personally very opposed to the mandatory digital ID proposed by the government, and I would have been very aggrieved if I'd been tricked into setting one up, believing it was just an innocent onboarding process for new employees. This is very dangerous, and people need to be aware of this, in my opinion. I hope you can help spread the word. Well, here I am. Your wish is my command. I'm helping spread the word because this is quite outrageous that you weren't given the right information as to what this was, what it was for, or potentially what it could be used for in the future. Because there are huge risks with all of this, which I'll come back to in just a moment. Now, having done a little bit of reading into the several sets of terms and conditions for various services that this app provides, I'm somewhat pleased to say that there are no blanket provisions that say they can just share your user data with any other third-party company if they choose to do so. But there are some that are a little bit vague, a little bit uncertain, possibly risky, lacking some sort of certainty and clarity. One of which refers to law enforcement and fraud, which obviously any company is going to share data with the police and authorities with related to alleged fraud and so on. But there is another one that looks towards some sort of regulations and complying with legal requirements. And so if the government did make it a requirement that these companies provide access to such data, they would, I presume, be complying with those regulations and sharing that information with the Home Office. This would all be subject to what the new laws say and whether it can be enforced, whether there's any claim against them to prevent them from doing so, but all of which is just yet another risk for digital ID being stored in this way and in some instances collected and verified by third parties, because one of the requirements is to verify this data with third parties. So by default, they are communicating with some third parties to even verify the data in the first place. So now, as promised, some proof as to why you really should be worried about your data being stored on some kind of digital ID and the potential of it being hacked and leaked and so on. And the best way to prove that something is a risk of happening is when it's already happened. As you can see from the ICO website here, data breaches put DA victims' lives at risk. According to the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner, the UK's regulator for data. The warning, it says, comes after the ICO reprimands several organisations in the past 14 months for data breaches affecting victims of this kind of nature. Most cases relate to organisations improperly disclosing the victim's home address to the perpetrators. Now, I can tell you from our experience as a law firm that this really does happen. And it happens with various organizations. One example we have that I can tell you from our personal experience acting as the lawyers on the case was I was asked to do an advice to determine the quantum, the amount of damages available in a particular case where the bank had sent details to the opposite party who was a victim in this kind of offense. Now, obviously, they didn't know where they lived beforehand, but they did when they received this confirmation from the bank that they were living there, which obviously put them at serious risk to the tune of many thousands of pounds. I forget the exact amount, but it was many thousands of pounds that I concluded that they would be due in compensation for this breach of their privacy and their personal data. And this just confirms that this is happening all over the place with all sorts of organizations, many people's home address being released to alleged perpetrators. The Commissioner urges organisations to take responsibility for training their staff and putting appropriate systems in place to avoid such incidents. But one reason this will happen again and again is because sometimes the mistake is so simple you really couldn't believe it. Now, in this one here, blundering is probably the most appropriate word. Blundering DWP shares the email addresses of all green paper consultation event participants because they just shared all of the staff that were going to attend this meeting in the to field rather than the blind copied field. Therefore, they all received all of the email addresses. And falling short of actually apologizing for the mistake, they didn't even really admit the mistake. They just said, apologies for the team's invite that was shared. There was a technical difficulty. Yeah, you cocked up. The previous scheduled team's meeting has now been cancelled and a new invitation will be shared with you shortly. That's their best way of trying to say, please ignore the last one because that was a data breach of serious magnitude. Moving back to the ICO, The 4 cases, organisations revealing the safe addresses of the victims of their alleged abuser. In one family case, had to be immediately moved to emergency accommodation, revealing identities of women seeking information about their partners to those partners, disclosing the home address of 2 adopted children to their father, who was imprisoned on 3 counts of really serious things against the mother, sending an unredacted assessment about children at risk of harm to the mother's ex-partners. Honestly, these are genuine and real concerns that happen all the time. And when you consider which organisations had leaked this data, you might be more amazed still, or perhaps not. Organisations involved a law firm, a housing association, an NHS trust, a government department, local councils, and a police service. Root causes for the breaches vary, but common themes are a lack of staff training and a failure to have robust procedures in place to handle personal information safely. These families reached out for help to escape unimaginable violence, to protect them from harm and to seek support and move forward from dangerous situations. But the very people they trusted for help exposed them to further risk. This is a pattern that must stop. Organisations should be doing everything necessary to protect the personal information in their care. The reprimands issued in the past year make it clear that mistakes were made and that organisations must resolve these issues that lead to these breaches in the first place. Getting the basics right is simple. Thorough training, double-checking records and contact details, restricting access to information. All these things reduce the risk of even greater harm. Protecting the information rights of victims of DA is a priority area for my office, and we'll be providing further support and advice to keep people safe. And if you thought that was it, guess again. There are dozens of stories like this, and they're not difficult to find. This one here, DWP, exposed more than 6,000 disability claimants' national insurance numbers online. If they want to prevent illegal working, which is often done through national insurance numbers that have been borrowed or stolen, perhaps they want to focus on things like this, rather than ensuring every single person in the UK has a digital ID, which would provide easy access to hackers. Because in this case, whilst the DWP insists that it takes its responsibility to protect data very seriously, it left the confidential details of 6,000 odd people unsecured on the internet for over 2 years. After the Mirror exposed the story, the analysis of the unsecured files revealed that they were published in March and June 2018 and included details of routine payments to the outsourcing firm Capita, which assesses people's eligibility for PIP payments. And since doing a few videos on this, I've had a number of professionals, software developers, cybersecurity specialists, and so on contact me, one of whom said as follows: as a software developer by profession, my viewer writes, I think your video hits 95% of my concerns, although I think it only just misses the remaining 5, which is a very good point, which is why I'm reading it out. This is what I think was missed and is to come. Digital ID will be an app, obviously. The app will only work on phones as follows: with surveillance enabled. For example, fairly modern iPhones, which of course has end-to-end encryption disabled by requirement and probably EU chat control software installed too, non-rooted and non-jailbroken. A jailbroken phone would allow the user to disable surveillance. Privacy-centric Android OS, Graphene OS, is warning that Google is locking down Android and they don't know why. The digital ID will pigeonhole into using the devices with full surveillance capabilities, enforcing the surveillance. A 2-phone approach would be necessary to avoid it, one with the ID app installed and used for nothing more, and a secondary device used for everything else. However, the government will have a campaign to convince people that using a secondary phone is criminal and trying to hide in the dark areas where the government can't catch them doing crime. The public are already used to criminals using 2 phones, a second burner phone, so the government will just jump on that. One final, particularly scary thought, my viewer writes, for the future, but by no means impossible, is that sentences are sent to others in chat apps can be analysed using an on-device hardware, AI natural language processing, to apply a risk to sentences that go against government narrative. AI could quickly build a risk to say, this person is right-wing, this person disagrees with X policy. Once a threshold is met, the thought police are sent to check the person out. Digital ID will leave no one available to avoid this, well, as long as they want to have a job, get paid, have food on the table, and a roof over their heads. And I think those are genuine concerns, because it would sound ridiculous, but for the fact that we have had police turning up at people's houses because of what they posted online. And even a reform councillor just the other day saying that she was born and bred in a certain area. And albeit the police have, I believe, now dismissed that, they did investigate it, which was all a little bit strange, just because she made a comment that somebody found offensive. And spurring off the non-crime hate incident reports, which hopefully will fall away because many of the senior police are saying that they should fall away. They were, by default, by their nature, by literal definition, they were not a criminal incident. It was just a hate incident that somebody subjectively feels offence, either on their own behalf or on behalf of someone else. And they report that to the police, and then it's listed as a hate incident, and therefore they get investigated for it. Imagine the extent to which that would be applied if everything you ever sent on your own phone was tracked, as my viewer software developer suggests here. Scary thoughts indeed. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.